Good morning. I'm Brad Cole, Executive Director of the Illinois Municipal League, joined here today with others from the business community who will introduce themselves and speak later. On March 27th, the federal government enacted the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, popularly known as the CARES Act. That legislation sent $150 billion to state and local governments across the country. However, the CARES Act only sent direct payments to local governments with more than 500,000 in population. In Illinois, that meant one city, the city of Chicago, and 5 counties. The counties of Cook, DuPage, Kane, Lake, and Will. Members of Congress on both sides of the aisle made it clear that states were expected to share a portion of federal CARES Act funding with the local governments that did not receive direct federal assistance. The state of Illinois in total was allocated $4.9 billion in federal CARES Act funding. Of that, $2.2 billion was allocated for direct and non-direct local governments across the state, and of that, $800 million was for the non-direct local governments, meaning the 5 direct counties and 1 direct city received a total of $1.4 billion. 2 months later, in May, the Illinois General Assembly passed legislation and a budget authorizing the use of $250 million of federal CARES Act money as payments to municipalities and counties that did not receive direct federal funding. The difference between the $800 million amount and the $250 million amount was retained by the state to establish their own related programs. Throughout all of this, cities, villages, and towns have been spending funds and dedicating resources to protect their employees, provide for their communities, and stabilize their businesses. As early as April 2nd, we began conversations with the governor's office and state agencies about this funding, urging them to prioritize releasing money to communities quickly and without unnecessary regulations. It was not until June 30th, one day before the federal funding was supposed to become available as part of the new state budget, that the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity announced their program's timeline and then later submitted the program's proposed rulemaking language. That timeline is shorter than the federal government's, and it implemented eligibility requirements that are more restrictive than federal guidance. We see at the Illinois Municipal League 3 significant problems with DCEO's proposed rules. The state's rules are more restrictive than the federal guidelines. The state's rules eliminate 60 days before the federal deadline that local governments can request reimbursements. And the state has the opportunity to reallocate local funds based on the state's needs after that shorter time period. This will strip local governments of much needed federal dollars. In summary, Congress appropriated nearly $5 billion to the state of Illinois and its local governments. Outside of the direct funding counties and the city of Chicago, $800 million was designated for local governments. Those local governments are now likely to see only $250 million. Congress allowed state and local governments to use CARES Act funding for several specific purposes, one of which is supporting local businesses. The state has now made that an ineligible expense for local governments, but has retained that eligible expense for themselves. Congress also allows local governments to use funding for expenses incurred through December 30th. The state only allows local governments to request reimbursements through November 1st, after which the state could reallocate that funding. The issue is simple. Local officials know best how to support their own communities. Congress provided common sense guidance and an appropriate timeline for states to follow. There is no reason for states to implement their own burdensome, unnecessary restrictions that will only undermine federal efforts to keep communities afloat during this public health emergency. To summarize that even further, mayors and local officials across this state have had one hand tied behind their back because of the 4 months long delay in having access to federal funding. Now, those mayors and local officials will have the other hand tied behind their back because of additional state regulations and restrictions that will likely result in fewer dollars going to their communities and more dollars being reallocated by the state. Our request is equally simple. The state should amend its proposed rules and give local authorities and local officials the ability to best utilize all available federal funding as needed in their communities. If the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity does not wish to amend those restrictions, then we ask the General Assembly's Joint Committee on Administrative Rules to object to the proposed rulemaking and require DCEO to submit new program guidelines that will protect local decision-making and that will align with all federal guidelines and full timeline. The governor himself has said on many occasions that he supports direct federal funding to local governments. We agree, and now is the time to make that happen. Thank you, and it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Carr with the Illinois Retail Merchants Association.
Thank you, Brad. Good morning, everyone. Rob Carr, President and CEO of the Illinois Retail Merchants Association. I'd like to start by revisiting perhaps where the retail community has been throughout this pandemic. First, we faced unprecedented demand. We stepped up throughout that time, improving the supply chain to make sure everyone could obtain the goods and services they needed throughout. I'm proud of the retail sector because we implemented and pioneered many of the safety measures that are in place today that government ultimately put into their response as well. Most don't know this, but IRMA ran a 2-week statewide radio campaign aimed at consumers, encouraging them to incorporate social distancing into their shopping habits. And we have collaborated at every turn and continue to do so with the state, even when we've disagreed with a decision or a direction. On the other hand, the retail sector has been devastated. Other than the travel sector, no sector has been harder hit. The perception, I think, is that because retail is largely back open to some degree, everything is fine, when in fact that's far from the truth. We're on life support. We're buying time. It's far from back to normal. A restaurant, for example, can't operate at 50%. They need something closer to 80% to just have a shot at profitability. For retail stores, 50% is also a lifeline. That means as well that state and local government revenues will continue to suffer. We are the largest generator of taxes for the local governments and the second largest for the state. Until retail recovers, neither does state or local governments. While we appreciate the efforts the state has undertaken to date to assist businesses, particularly the smallest of businesses, those under 50 employees, and particularly restaurants and taverns, there's a much larger retail segment that is struggling and must also be addressed. We support the call for local governments to have access to this money. They know better how to direct it. We believe there can be accountability measures built in to their decision making and to how they spend their money. That's already done through numerous grant procedures that have been in place for years. Both the federal government and the Illinois General Assembly, when they adopted the budget implementation bill, voted to ensure these assistance monies would make their way to local governments in every district throughout the state, and we believe both the intent of the Congress and the Assembly should be honored here. And it's my pleasure to introduce Gordy Holton with the Illinois Manufacturers Association.
Good morning. My name is Gordy Holton. I'm the Vice President for External Affairs at the Illinois Manufacturers Association. I'll be brief. I know it's warm. I appreciate you all coming out this morning. The IMA is proud to join the Illinois Municipal League and the Illinois Retail Merchants Association this morning to talk about this plan from the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, which would limit the flow of federal economic development dollars to communities and businesses in desperate need of help during this coronavirus pandemic. As our communities see more and more businesses closing their doors for good, including the one behind me, it is clear immediate action is needed to help our local economies. Many assistance programs currently in place are too narrow, and do not benefit the companies that need it most. To make matters worse, the abbreviated spring legislative session did little to help Illinois employers during this difficult time, failing to provide relief on wage hikes or easing burdensome regulations that drive up costs. Our congressional leaders got it right when they passed legislation to allow local officials to spend federal dollars on economic recovery. They understood a fundamental truth, that local officials know the needs of their communities best. It is disappointing the state wants to now stand in the way of the help that our businesses need now more than ever. As Rob said, similar to retailers, manufacturers across Illinois have stepped up during this pandemic to meet the challenges facing our state and our nation. While safely employing hundreds of thousands of Illinoisans, manufacturers ramped up production of personal protective equipment, found innovative ways to make life-saving medical devices, worked to ensure store shelves remain stocked, and are leading the way forward on development of a vaccine. Manufacturers also provide high-wage jobs that are badly needed during this crisis. Yet another reason they need our state government to be an ally in this fight, not another obstacle. We are calling on DCEO to let local governments use these funds to help businesses as the federal government intended, instead of being reallocated elsewhere. Thank you.
We'll be glad to take any questions anybody might have.
Brad, we're getting close to an election. What kind of concerns are there that Illinois doesn't have a great track record as is when it comes to distributing funds to nonprofits or businesses or whatever? I reckon back to Quinn and the NRI program. Are there the same types of concerns here as we get closer to an election and this type of money involved?
The issue for us at the local level is not the upcoming state and national elections. The issue is making sure that the funds that are designated for local communities are distributed by local officials as they see best to help those communities. I think the election can get in the way and be a problem. I don't know if that's the case here, but municipal officials are not up for election in November. They're up for election every day because they have to deliver for the needs and services of their residents. And so far, their hands have been tied behind their backs.
Election aside, does the state have a good track record of managing these types of funds?
Well, I think you can see from the math that I laid out initially, we went from 4.9 billion to 2.2 billion to 800 million to 250 million is all that's going to end up in these communities. So we're going the wrong way, and I think we'd rather see that distributed by the local officials than the state officials.
Have local governments had trouble getting that money, and is there certain elements of aid that have been denied to some across the state as a result?
So far they have received no money, and that's part of the issue. 4 months after the passage of the federal act, local officials, local communities, local governments have received none of the funding that was intended to stabilize them during this public health crisis. Additionally, the state is proposing to implement an agreement or application process that will require local governments to go through various steps before they're even eligible to receive the funding after the additional restrictions are placed. So it has been problematic, but nobody has received any of the money locally at this time.
Nor has anybody been denied a very comfortable order.
Well, they've been denied because they can't access it. So local governments started spending their local dollars on day one of this public health emergency. We're now 4 months later with just the opportunity to sign an agreement to be eligible to apply for funding.
So you're saying that if all of this money isn't used or sent to local governments or businesses via the state, not by a local mechanism, but by the state, then the state is going to possibly reallocate those dollars elsewhere to like roads?
It's slightly different than the question. As we understand the rules that are proposed by DCEO, if an eligible community does not disperse all of its allocation, then the remaining funds, 60 days before the federal deadline, will be reallocated by the state. So the state will basically be able to take those funds back because they haven't been requested for reimbursement. Just for example, just to give you one community, the city of Peoria, Illinois, is due an allocation of $4.7 million, according to the guidelines set forth in both the federal and the state program. Of that $4.7 million, they have already, as a city of Peoria, expended about $1.1 million in direct costs that they have incurred. That means $3.6 million will go back to the state to decide how to spend it, because the city of Peoria is not able to determine how to use those dollars in their own community, such as supporting the manufacturers and retail businesses within that specific community. That means they will basically be able to spend 25 cents on the dollar. And those other dollars will be reallocated according to the state, not knowing where they're going or what they'll be used for.
What happens if they don't, if this DCEO guide or deadline didn't exist and they didn't spend it or allocate it by that 60-day later federal deadline? What happens then for the federal?
Right. The federal guidelines allow the expenses to be incurred through December 30th. The piece that the state is disallowing is the support for economic activities within the community. No community is going to leave money on the table and not support their local businesses and return money back to the federal government. So without these restrictions, local governments will have their hands untied so they can put money back into the community, back to support their local businesses and residents. There won't be money going back to the federal government. However, under this plan, if cities don't do it fast enough and they're not able to do it fully according to the federal guidelines, then the state will take that money back and do what they wish with it.
And when you say do what they wish with it, I mean, are you worried that it's going to go to things that aren't COVID related or providing economic relief to hard-hit businesses or governments?
We're not worried that the funds the state reallocates will be going to non-COVID related expenses, because by federal guidelines they have to. However, the state will be able to use all of the resources according to the federal guidelines, whereas they're saying we can't. And so they will reallocate those dollars, and instead of them going to Peoria or Quincy or Decatur or Springfield or Rockford or Carbondale, they'll go to another community that is a state priority versus a local priority within those specific communities.
They give it to Chicago?
They could give.
Chicago's already getting a block grant, right? I mean, they're already getting something that doesn't go through this process.
Chicago received direct funding. Theoretically, the state could reallocate it to any community for any purpose that meets the federal guidelines. And so, yes, a community downstate, Cairo, could have its money taken away and given to Chicago. We believe Chicago should have the same rights to spend the funding according to federal guidelines, just like Cairo. And in fact, Chicago does, because they received it directly, but Cairo does not. Please. Yeah. Well, yes, just to reiterate that point, is that one of the criteria has been removed by the state. That economic assistance allowance through the Federal Act has been removed for local governments. The state can still do that. So they didn't restrict themselves. They just restricted their local governments. Nothing else for these guys?
Yeah, off topic, I guess. Well, kind of on topic, but Rob, you had mentioned just the toll that retailers have gone through and restaurants have gone through in the past three and a half months or so. I guess react to the difference between Southern Illinois and other parts of the state when it comes to following the regulations or the recommendations. You put out a public service announcement saying, hey, it's a good idea to follow these types of things, but is it time to reinforce those things, or how do you address those maybe dismissing the guidelines?
We have continually encouraged our members, and I know for a fact, I've been in some stores the last couple of days, they are continuing to reinforce the guidelines, mask requirements. I mean, we're seeing a call, we echoed a call of a national organization that we work with for all governors to impose a mask requirement. So we are continuing to enforce those, to support those. We worked with the Pritzker administration early on in those. As I mentioned, we did a 2-week statewide radio campaign to enforce those. So we believe they should continue to be enforced. It's one of the big reasons, I think, why Illinois has done so well and appears to continue to do well, while others have not. So we continue to encourage that.
And then we're standing in front of the feed store. They announced that they're closing just down the street Augie's. I mean, there's going to be so many vacant buildings. I don't know if you want to address this or if Brad wants to address it from a municipal perspective, but what can be done to build back up some of these vacant storefronts that are going to be not just in Springfield, but
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the state missed a golden opportunity. What they could have done is while they're pushing assistance to the small businesses, what they could have and should have done is suspended the minimum wage increase that took effect July 1. It is unconscionable that you're seeing the retail community devastated the way it is, and the state is artificially continuing to put ahead another, what will now account to, when they do another one January 1, an over 33% increase in the minimum wage in 13 months. You're worried that you're not getting your tax revenue from both state and local governments. You're worried that unemployment is at record levels, yet you're doing everything to discourage investment. You're doing everything to discourage recovery. We didn't suggest repeal it. We suggested a 1-year suspension. That was simple, easy, low-hanging fruit. And it met with a deaf ear. That's one thing they could do. The other thing they could do is they could look at deferring some property tax payments. You could spread those out rather than 2 lump sum. You could spread them out over 4, for example. Everyone still gets their money. It does, as we discussed with policymakers, it does create a cash flow issue for some. But there's a difference between a cash flow issue or a structural long-term revenue hit, which is what they're facing by not providing some means to enable the retail community to stand back on its feet. So there are some concrete things we laid out, and at least to date, all of those have been rejected.
Brad, do you want to address that? What can municipalities do to spur on investment to get some of these storefronts filled?
Well, that's exactly the issue we're talking about. By taking federal funds that have been approved for local governments and restricting them beyond the federal guidelines and threatening to reallocate them to other purposes, you're taking dollars out of the mayor's, aldermen, and city council members' pocket to be able to spend on their communities with those businesses. Now, some businesses are closing because it's time to close. Other businesses are closing because they can't make payroll. They can't pay the light bill. If local governments were allowed to use these funds, according to the federal guidelines, they could provide incentive grants to those businesses to pay the light bill or pay the rent or keep their employees employed. That's exactly what we're talking about. Let's keep the money locally. Let's not reallocate it. Let's give it to local officials so they can spend it on local businesses for local purposes to keep local communities thriving. So, thank you all very much.
Brad, I had a question. Talked to you a couple of months ago about the gas tax and how at the time it was coming in low, was going to, we thought, damage local road projects. Where does that all stand now? Do you feel there's been enough of a recovery, or are there a lot of road projects that aren't going to happen?
Well, we're seeing a reduction of anywhere from 15 to 50% in shared revenues, such as motor fuel tax. We're going to see a reduction in income tax, likely, that will relate down to local governments. And so any reduction because of the economic impact is going to have a subsequent impact on those projects. So because motor fuel tax is down 15 to 25%, then that means those projects are going to be delayed, or at least they won't be as significant as they would have been if all the funds were coming in. That has not recovered. We cannot make up for 4 months of business that didn't happen, or travel that didn't occur, or overnight stays that weren't made. That just can't be made up, and so communities are struggling with that. Thank you all.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.